Hi everyone, we're back to the Doldrums. We're on chapter 6 already. Let's go. All right. Helmsley House was never a loud place, but it was especially quiet in the weeks that followed the polar bear incident. There are always exceptions, but in general, sending someone to the hospital is frowned upon in a civil society. During those weeks, the door to Archer's room was locked, except when a tray of food was brought in. For a while, that tray contained leftovers from the Merkley dinner party, forcing Archer to relive that night over and over again. Why had he been so foolish? Archer stretched out across his bed and tried reading his grandfather's journals, but he kept putting them down. Oliver stopped by one morning and convinced Archer to sneak over to his house. Archer was glad he did. "He's innocent," cried Claire. "Of course he is," says Mr. Glubb, placing his hands on Archer's shoulders. "Perhaps not in the classical sense, but she had no right to come into your house and insult your grandparents as she did. I've never met anyone who had something bad to say about Ralph and Rachel." "I think she likes to argue," said Oliver. Mrs. Glubb agreed and slid an apple cider turnover in front of Archer. "You'll always find trouble if you go looking for it." Archer was glad to have the Glubb's support, but he wished his parents would take a similar stance, and they didn't. One evening when the door to his room was finally unlocked, Archer joined his parents for dinner. But there was little chewing of the fat. Everyone was chewing on something else. Mrs. Helmsley looked at him with an expression similar to the one she made while smelling the milk to see if it was still safe to drink. "You'll be putting all of this nonsense behind you," she said. "One more incident like that, I do mean one more, and I'll be contacting Ravenwood. These outbursts, these tendencies, they're dangerous, and they end now." Even Mr. Helmsley didn't argue. Archer didn't know much about Ravenwood, except that it was a boarding school 3 hours north of Rosewood by train. To one side the school was shrouded in thick pines, and to the other was a rocky beach and the same sea that bordered Rosewood. Archer told Oliver Ravenwood was the school Mrs. Merkley had left, and though she never said why, both agreed it didn't say much about the institution. "I'll bet all the teachers there are like her," said Oliver. Archer tried his best to be extra careful around his mother. It's a curious thing, however, that when you're trying to be extra careful, you always end up doing something careless. Archer was no exception, and one day Archer did something careless. He left his secret bookshelf uncovered when his mother came in with freshly ironed shirts and socks. "What are all these boxes?" she asked. Archer jumped to his feet with such haste that his heart ended up somewhere around his left ankle. "Nothing," he said, trying to usher her out. "They're nothing." Mrs. Helmsley wouldn't budge. She bent down and removed a box. "Are these from... But how did they... Archer paled. "Those aren't mine," he said, not sure what else to say. His mother eyed him. "They have your name on them." Archer slumped down on the edge of his bed. Mrs. Helmsley began grabbing packages left and right and didn't stop till her arms were full and the shelves were empty. She took the journals, too. Only the glass eye dared an escape. When she reached the door, it fell from the stack and rolled over to Archer's foot. He kicked it under his bed. "We'll talk about this later," she said. But days went by and it was never mentioned again. There was only one time Archer could remember feeling more miserable, and that was the morning he discovered the iceberg headline. But there was a small reprieve in the midst of all this. Construction began on the house just opposite him, and it began very early one morning. Archer leaned against his balcony railing in his pajamas and stared across the way. For the first time he didn't recognize his view. The house across the garden, the house where he'd seen the flowery woman and the tall, well-groomed man, was now covered in scaffolding. Workers climbed up and down ladders at a frantic pace, shouting, "Be careful, lift with your back, that's it, that can't be right. Is it supposed to look like that?" Oliver jumped out on his own balcony and yelled, "What's going on?" Archer couldn't hear him over the noise. He motioned and Oliver climbed the ladder to join him. "Good morning," Archer mumbled. "This is not a good morning," said Oliver, who just moments before had leaped from his bed thinking the world was coming to an end. Down below, Mrs. Merkley stormed out through the garden door, followed by Henry, who was carrying a ladder. It was clear she'd made a full recovery from the polar bear incident and was back to her cheery self. Archer boiled just looking at her. She snatched the ladder from her husband, propped it up against the wall, and when she reached the top, began barking at the workers. Henry, who was still in his bathrobe and slippers, disappeared back inside. "What's the meaning of all this?" Mrs. Merkley growled. The construction stopped. A man approached the wall and handed her what looked like a business card. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "My name is Pierre." A second man approached and handed her a second business card. "My name is also Pierre," he said. After that, they spoke in unison. "We're the brothers Pierre, home remodelers, at your service." Mrs. Merkley studied one Pierre and then the other. "You're a circus act is what you are," she said, and threw the cards over their heads. "Have you any idea what time it is?" One Pierre looked up at the sun. The other Pierre looked down at his watch. They reached the same conclusion. 7 in the morning, both said. "But the sooner we're here," said Pierre number 1, "the sooner we can leave," said Pierre number 2. "This is weird," said Oliver. Archer agreed. Mrs. Merkley pointed at the scaffolding. "If even so much as one little piece of anything falls into my garden, I'll make sure the police are ready for you. Henry, get the phone." "Henry?" She turned, but Henry was gone. "Useless man." The workers laughed. "Keep laughing, you fools. You'll see what happens." The construction lasted a number of weeks, and while the noise was constant, Archer didn't mind because it muffled his sorrows. He stood near the balcony door with his binoculars raised, watching as Mrs. Merkley checked for garden debris. She was rather like a mole popping its head from its subterranean lair to gander at the happenings of the above-ground dwellers. There was no debris, but there was a great deal of dust, and that dust ruined the summer flower festival. Mrs. Helmsley was furious when her flowers bloomed a chalky white. A few weeks later, when the construction came to an end and the scaffolding was removed, Archer stared up from the Glubbs' garden at a house unlike any he'd seen. It was tall and skinny like all the houses on Willow Street, but that's all it had in common. "What is it?" asked Archer. "I think it's French," said Mr. Glubb. "Parisian, to be precise." "Whatever it is, it's beautiful," said Mrs. Glubb, who couldn't help but compare it to the garden they were standing in. Archer was leaning against the garden wall so his mother wouldn't see him. Mrs. Helmsley was also staring out the window at this most unusual home. "Well," said Mr. Glubb, "it might be beautiful, but I bet they don't have—" He stopped and searched the garden. "Where's my flamingo?" Archer and Oliver slipped inside. The movers arrived a few days later. Archer and Oliver watched with the binoculars as furniture and boxes and all manner of odds and ends were carried throughout the house. It was quite the production. When the movers finished, the quiet of Willow Street was restored, and with it, Archer's thoughts, which were now more dismal than ever. The boxes were gone, the journals were gone, his grandparents were gone. He had nothing except Helmsley House, which he would not be leaving for the foreseeable future. If you've ever spent as much time in your house as Archer had, you might find yourself as he did, growing pale, and your spirits even paler. What hope did he have of restoring the Helmsley Golden Age from inside his house? What could he do in there that would make his grandparents proud? There was nothing he could do, nothing except feel very small while surrounded by their greatness. Archer shook his head. He wasn't like his grandfather. He was just a boy who fell asleep with his head inside a polar bear. 1 week after the movers left, Archer and Oliver met on the rooftop as they did almost every night. Only this night was unlike other nights. In fact, this night would change everything in Archer's world. But Archer didn't know that yet. No, as he climbed the ladder to join Oliver, he was certain nothing in his world would ever change unless his grandparents returned. It was a cool, crisp evening. Archer licked his finger and held it above his head. "A slight south by southwest breeze," he said. "I think so," said Oliver, looking north by northeast. The stars waited patiently for the sun to disappear behind the houses, then assumed their positions one by one till the stage was set and the night began. Archer was poking a stick in the gutter when he spotted a beetle crawling atop a leaf. He picked it up. He'd never seen one like this before. It was blue with yellow spots and looked quite special. But he wasn't interested. He flicked it down into the gardens. Oliver watched the beetle whiz by. "I guess we'll find out if Mrs. Merkley really eats them," he said, hoping it would make Archer smile. It didn't. Archer sat down next to him and dangled his legs over the edge. "I used to think I was lucky to be a Helmsley," he said, "but it turned into a curse after the iceberg." Archer was certain everything would be different had that not happened, but it had, and it seemed like a long time ago, more than 2 years now, and that made it worse. "They're not coming back," he admitted. Archer had spent a considerable amount of time trying to figure out the life expectancy of an iceberg dweller, and what he had concluded was troubling. He frequently ran the numbers, but the results were always the same. The main problem was fire. "You couldn't survive without a fire," he said, "but you can't start one on an iceberg." Oliver agreed, but after a moment offered his own idea. "Maybe they dug," he said. "That doesn't make any sense. Where would you dig?" "To the center of the iceberg," said Oliver with a shrug. "At least that's what I would do." Oliver had also given considerable thought to the situation. Oliver would dig. He would dig to the center of the iceberg, because a small hole deep inside would be warm enough to keep him from freezing, but not be so warm as to melt the iceberg. And in the mornings when the sun rose over the ocean, it would glisten through the thick walls of the ice, and that would be a beautiful sight to wake up to. "The sun would warm the hole," he added with another shrug. "Did you read that somewhere?" asked a befuddled Archer. Oliver shook his head. But I've been thinking about it ever since I saw the headline," he said. "I try to stay ahead of situations I might find myself in later on." This was, in fact, a daily exercise for Oliver. Each night he read his father's paper and tried to find solutions to the unfortunate situations other people found themselves in, just in case. Archer was confused. This was an Oliver he'd never seen before, mainly because Archer was too caught up in his own ideas to hear what Oliver might suggest. And what Oliver suggested was brilliant. But Oliver grew uncomfortable with Archer's staring and checked his forehead. "Is something crawling on me?" he asked. "We have to go to Antarctica," said Archer. Oliver laughed, but Archer wasn't joking. "You're serious?" said Oliver. "Yes," said Archer. "But that's impossible." "It will be difficult," Archer corrected him, "but not impossible." Oliver shook his head. "There are at least 3 big problems with that. And the first is that even if you were successful, even if you somehow made it to Antarctica, you'd still probably die down there." Archer leaned back on the roof and asked, "What else?" Oliver blinked a few times. "That's not a big enough problem for you," he said, and then sighed and continued. "The second is that if you're not successful, if you get caught, you'll be shipped off to Ravenwood, which might be worse. The third is that you have no experience with anything of the sort. Antarctica is not an impulse destination." He didn't like to do so, but Archer admitted he had no experience. He had no experience to do anything he wanted to do. "But what if I found someone who did?" he said after a moment. "Someone who could help us. What if I went to Antarctica and found my grandparents? If I could make it happen, you would come with me, wouldn't you?" Oliver didn't like the look in Archer's eye. This might be more serious than the library plans. Fortunately, Mr. Glubb poked his head over the roof's edge. "I had a feeling you'd be up here," he said. "And a good evening to you, Archer." Mr. Glubb looked up at the stars. "A fine evening, isn't it? Makes me sorry to break you up, but Oliver wanted to help me organize the weeklies. Unless he's changed his mind, of course." Oliver hadn't changed his mind. It was all too eager to escape. He said goodbye and climbed down the ladder. Archer disappeared down his ladder as well. He turned on his radio, left the balcony door open so he could hear it, and returned to the roof with his binoculars, which he pointed to the sky. He found the constellation Orion, the great hunter, and for the first time in weeks, Archer smiled. "Don't worry," he said. "We won't be stuck here much longer." Down in the gardens, the crickets exchanged moonlight pleasantries. "Good evening," chirped one. "Leave me alone," chirped another. Up on the rooftop, Archer was still thinking about Antarctica. He did lack experience. He couldn't argue with that. But with the right help, with someone who did have experience, it wouldn't be impossible. He would need time to prepare and a ship to stow away on, and of course a good escape plan because Oliver was right. The consequences of failing and getting caught would be great. but consequences don't matter when they're connected to something that you have to do. Archer continued to jump from constellation to constellation till he landed on the beginnings of one he did not recognize. He adjusted his binoculars. It wasn't a star. It was the garden light of the peculiar house on the opposite side of the garden. "Your bedroom is upstairs," called the tall, well-groomed man who had just turned on the garden light. Archer watched the second-floor light flicker on, followed by the third-floor light, and finally the top-floor light. "It's the door on your left," said the tall, well-groomed man. A girl entered the top-floor room carrying a suitcase. She was followed shortly by the tall, well-groomed man with more luggage. The girl went to the balcony door and stepped outside. "Perhaps we should find you a room lower down," he said. "This will be fine," the girl replied. The man set the luggage down and left the room. The girl leaned against the railing and looked into the gardens. The south by southwest breeze changed directions and blew the music from Archer's bedroom to the girl's balcony. The girl spotted him. Archer quickly lowered his binoculars. She raised herself to the tips of her toes and for a moment stood perfectly still. Archer lifted his binoculars once more. The girl began spinning and it looked very pretty till she lost her balance and collapsed with a thud. "Sur la table, Adelaide," the tall, well-groomed man called from the garden. The girl picked herself up and stepped back inside. The top-floor light flickered off, followed by the third-floor light and finally the second-floor light. "Adelaide," thought Archer. "What's an Adelaide?" Her name was Adelaide. Adelaide L. Belmont. Adelaide is a French name. "And how do you pronounce it?" asked the custom officer, looking up from her passport. It took Adelaide a moment to respond because she was enchanted by just how much this man resembled a walrus. "Adelaide Belmont," she finally said. "The T is quiet." "I think you mean it's silent," the walrus replied. "No," she said, "just quiet. You can sometimes hear it." Adelaide had a French name because Adelaide was French. And Adelaide was French because before she arrived in Rosewood Port, Adelaide lived in France. "And what brings you across the sea?" asked the officer. Adelaide bit her lip, tapped her fingers on the walrus desk, and looked over her shoulder at her father, who was piling luggage onto a cart. She wasn't sure how to answer this question. She herself was surprised when her father made the announcement. That's not to say she was upset by it. On the contrary, Adelaide was glad to leave France. But the reason? "Ballet," she said, turning back to the walrus. "So you're a ballerina?" "Not anymore." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Why not anymore?" he asked. "Bread," she replied. The officer raised a second eyebrow. "You're not a ballerina anymore because of bread?" "Mostly croissants," said Adelaide. At that, the walrus stood up and Adelaide watched as he refilled his coffee, sharpened his pencil, and waddled back to his seat. "I just want to make sure I have this straight," he said, looking over his notes. "You say you come across the sea for ballet, even though, thanks to croissants, you're no longer a ballerina. Is that correct?" Adelaide is right there. Can you see her? There. It was not completely correct, and the order of events was a bit confusing, but Adelaide knew what she was doing, so she smiled and nodded. "Very well," the officer replied, having no idea what any of that was supposed to mean. He stamped her passport and handed it back to her. "Best of luck to you." "Merci, monsieur." Adelaide carried her suitcase outside. Her father hailed a taxicab and they piled their luggage into the trunk. "Where to?" asked the cab driver. "To 3076 North Willow Street," Mr. Belmont said. He raised an invisible glass in the air. Into a change of scenery. Now, before we continue, there's a chance some of you might be wondering many of the same things that the walrus was. It sounds like a bunch of nonsense, doesn't it? The truth is that it's not nonsense, but Adelaide was a clever girl, and while she didn't want to lie to an officer, she did want to confuse him because she didn't want to talk about it. So in order to answer these questions, it's best that we go back in time. Back to sometime back to the same time Archer opened his front door and discovered his grandparents had drifted out to sea atop an iceberg. When that happened, Adelaide was 9 and lived in France, in the north of Paris to be precise. And it's there that you must go, whether by plane or boat, or si tu préfères, iceberg. Bon voyage. Woo! That is the end of chapter 6. And tomorrow we go to part 2, A Girl from the North of Paris. Dun, dun, dun. See you tomorrow.